Vivian Cross leaned into Adrian Voss's ear in that hospital corridor, her perfume cutting through antiseptic and fear, and whispered 4 words like she was claiming a deed to property she'd been circling for years. Now you belong to me. Adrian didn't flinch, didn't turn. His eyes stayed fixed on the emergency room doors, like a man waiting for a verdict he already knew he deserved. His wife was in there, his child was in there, and the woman who had spent 3 years threading herself through every crack in his marriage was standing beside him in a black dress, smiling. Then the doors opened. A doctor stepped out 40-something, gray at the temples, the kind of exhausted that doesn't perform itself. He looked at Adrian and said, "The baby survived." 3 words. And every version of Adrian Voss that had ever existed, the enforcer, the boss, the man who'd built an empire on other people's fear, cracked straight down the middle. If you've ever stood in a hospital hallway, waiting for news that could go either way, you know what that silence feels like. You know how the air gets heavy, how your hands don't know what to do with themselves, how every second stretches into something you can't measure. Now imagine standing in that hallway and the person beside you is the reason you're there. That's where this story begins. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Stories like this, one drop every week, and you don't want to walk in halfway through. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, and drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to the night everything broke open. The rain had been falling since 6 in the evening and showed no intention of stopping. Adrian Voss stood in the corridor of Hargrove Private Hospital on the 14th floor, which was the floor of the hospital reserved for patients whose families paid enough to ensure privacy and silence. There were no other visitors on the floor. There were 2 of his men posted at the stairwell doors and 1 at the elevator, not because Adrian had ordered them there. He hadn't said a word since the ambulance, but because that was simply what happened when Adrian Voss went somewhere. The perimeter closed around him automatically, the way it had for 11 years. He hadn't sat down. The chairs against the wall were there, beige and practical, and Adrian had looked at them once and looked away. Sitting felt like surrender to something he wasn't ready to name. Elena had been in surgery for 2 hours and 40 minutes. He knew this because he'd checked his watch 17 times. He knew the exact sequence of the last 3 hours in the kind of involuntary detail that the mind records during shock, the way it catalogs everything around the thing it cannot look at directly. He remembered the color of the ambulance interior. He remembered that one of the paramedics had a coffee stain on her sleeve. He remembered that Elena's hand, when he had held it in the back of that ambulance, had been completely still. Not the stillness of sleep, something else. He did not let himself think about what else. Vivian had arrived 40 minutes after him. He hadn't called her. He hadn't called anyone except the hospital and his head of security, Marcus Webb, who was currently somewhere downstairs doing something. Adrian had asked him to do 3 hours ago and still hadn't reported back on. Vivian had simply appeared, the way Vivian always appeared, as if she had been waiting nearby all along, fully dressed for the occasion. She'd stood beside him for a while without speaking, which he would have appreciated from anyone else. From Vivian, the silence had a weight to it, an expectation, like she was giving him time to notice how perfectly she was behaving. Then she leaned in. The perfume hit him first, something expensive and deliberate, completely wrong for a hospital, and then her voice, low and close, shaped those 4 words with a precision that was almost surgical. "Now you belong to me." Adrian had looked straight ahead. He didn't answer, didn't move. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, and the rain struck the window at the end of the corridor in irregular bursts. And Adrian Voss stood very still and felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with grief and nothing to do with fear. It was older than both of those things. It was the feeling a man gets when he realizes he has been looking at something every day for years without ever actually seeing it. Still didn't move. And then the emergency room doors opened, and the doctor came out, and the world reorganized itself around 3 words. The baby survived. The doctor's name was Hallberg. Adrian caught it on the badge. Hallberg looked like he'd been awake for 20 hours and had made peace with that. He looked at Adrian with the practiced steadiness of a man who had delivered news in both directions, enough time to know that the face he showed in this moment mattered. "The baby survived," Hallberg said. "We were able to perform an emergency cesarean. The infant is premature 31 weeks, but breathing independently. We have her in the NICU." Adrian heard that word, and it landed somewhere so deep in him that he had no ready response for it. He'd known they were having a girl. Elena had told him at 16 weeks, standing in their kitchen on a Sunday morning with the test results in her hand and her eyes bright in a way he hadn't seen in a long time. He'd nodded. He'd said something appropriate. He'd gone back to his phone 20 minutes later. He hadn't let himself think about the baby as a specific person until this exact moment. And Elena? His voice came out flat and controlled. He was aware of Vivian standing 2 feet to his left, listening. Hallberg's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Your wife is still in surgery. We've stabilized her condition, but she sustained significant internal trauma. We're doing everything we can. The next few hours will tell us more. Adrian nodded once. Hallberg held his gaze for a moment, the kind of look that carries more than what's been said, and then turned and went back through the doors. Adrian stood in the corridor for 30 seconds without speaking. Then he turned to the nearest of his men, Croft, 26, steady hands, and said, very quietly, "Get Marcus on the phone." Croft pulled his phone out and stepped away. Adrian did not look at Vivian. Vivian looked at him. He could feel it the way you feel a cold draft, not because it's dramatic, but because it's simply there, undeniable. "She's strong," Vivian said. "Elena is strong. She'll pull through." Adrian said nothing. "You should sit down, Adrian. You've been standing for almost 3 hours. Don't," he said. Quiet and absolutely final. Vivian went still. Adrian walked to the window at the end of the corridor and stood with his back to her, looking down at the rain-slicked street 14 floors below. And he started to think. Not about Elena, not about the baby. He wasn't ready to think about either of them, yet without the ground dropping out from under him. Instead, he thought about the 4 hours before the ambulance. He thought about what Marcus had found in the security system. He thought about what had been erased and what had been left behind, and what the gap between those two things meant. He thought about how Vivian had arrived at this hospital 40 minutes after him, when no one had told her where he was. He thought about the word her and how his daughter was in a room, somewhere in this building, breathing independently. And he understood for the first time with complete and terrible clarity what it meant to have something that could be used against you. He'd built an empire on leverage. He understood how leverage worked. The question was how long he'd been the one being leveraged. 12 hours earlier, the Voss estate had been precisely as quiet as it always was on a Thursday evening. That was the thing about power. At a certain level, it insulated you from noise. The house sat behind a stone wall on 4 acres outside the city proper, and the only sounds Adrian could usually hear from his study, on the second floor, were the wind in the oak trees along the north wall, and, occasionally, Elena moving around somewhere in the house below him. He'd learned to track her movements by sound over the years. Not out of tenderness, out of the same instinct that made him track everything, the habit of a man who needed to know where all the pieces were at all times. Elena had been moving differently lately. He'd noticed it the way you notice weather changing, a shift in pressure, rather than anything specific. She was 3 months from her due date and physically slower, which was expected. But there was something else, a carefulness. She went through rooms rather than settling in them. She spent long hours in the library on the ground floor, which she'd always loved, but recently she'd started closing the door. Adrian hadn't asked. He and Elena had not been close in the way that word usually meant for a long time. They were civil. They were functional. They had constructed, over 9 years, a kind of careful architecture of coexistence, meals together, when schedules allowed, public appearances managed with the smooth efficiency of a practiced performance, conversations that covered logistics and household decisions and stayed carefully clear of everything underneath. The baby had not been planned. He knew Elena knew that. He also knew she had wanted the baby more than she'd ever admitted, and that this had changed something in her that he hadn't been equipped to respond to properly. She'd started looking at him differently about 4 months ago. Less like a woman assessing a difficult situation. More like a woman who had made a decision. He didn't know what the decision was. He told himself it didn't matter. He was wrong about that. 7:14 that evening, his phone had rung. Unknown number, which was unusual for a phone that almost no one had. He'd answered it from habit. Silence. Then a woman's voice, not Elena's, not anyone he immediately recognized, said 6 words before the line went dead. She found something. Checked the library. Adrian had sat with the phone in his hand for approximately 8 seconds. Then he'd stood up, walked downstairs, and opened the library door. The room had been empty. No, not empty. Elena had been there. The reading chair by the east window had been warm when he touched the arm. A glass of water sat on the side table, barely touched. A book lay open on the ottoman. He'd looked at the cover, without meaning to, some novel, face down. And on the desk against the west wall, The desk that had been his father's, and that Elena used for correspondence, a drawer had been left fractionally open. He crossed the room and opened it fully. Inside 3 manila envelopes, a small flash drive taped to the inside of the drawer, and a handwritten note on the back of a torn envelope that read, in Elena's precise handwriting, "Do not move these. You are not ready to see this yet. I will explain everything when I'm back." Back from where? He'd reached for the envelopes. He'd heard a sound behind him, a footstep, or what might have been a footstep, and turned, and the room was still empty. And then his phone had buzzed with a message from Marcus, "Problem at the East Gate. Need you." He'd gone to the East Gate. 40 minutes later, Elena had been found at the bottom of the main staircase. The fall had not been witnessed. That was the first thing Marcus told him, in the controlled tone Marcus used when he was managing both information and his employer's reaction simultaneously. The house cameras on the staircase, there were 2, positioned to cover the entire run of steps, had a gap in their recording. 12 minutes. The footage simply wasn't there. 12 minutes, beginning at 7:51 p.m., and in the gap, Elena had gone down those stairs. The physical evidence at the scene was inconsistent with a simple fall. Adrian didn't need Marcus to explain what inconsistent meant. He'd been in enough rooms with people who'd been hurt on purpose to read the language of it. He'd stood at the base of the stairs looking at the space where Elena had been, and he'd felt something move through him that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not grief, not yet. Something colder. The kind of thing that lives underneath grief when a man has been doing what Adrian had been doing for most of his adult life. He recognized violence when he saw its aftermath. He recognized it because he had produced it. He'd called the ambulance himself. He'd told Marcus to lock the estate down and find out where Ramirez, the guard assigned to the East Wing, was. He'd ridden in the ambulance with Elena's hand in his, and the paramedic across from him working steadily, and the city moving past the small windows in the dark. And he'd understood for the first time that something had been happening inside his own house, under his own roof. And he had not seen it because he had been looking somewhere else. He'd been looking at Vivian. Vivian Cross had come into Adrian's life 3 years ago during a business negotiation that he now understood, in retrospect, had been structured precisely to produce that outcome. He hadn't seen it at the time. He'd been going through the motions of his marriage, a marriage that had cooled years before the cold became permanent, and Vivian had been precisely everything that Elena, in her quiet and careful way, was not. Vivian was loud in the way that money encourages. She filled rooms and conversations and silences with herself. She was beautiful in the deliberate manner of a woman who understood beauty as a resource to be managed. She was intelligent. Adrian had never underestimated that. And she was patient in the way that people are patient when they have a specific long-term outcome in mind. He had not asked too many questions about where she came from. That was his failure. He'd performed the surface-level checks, background, associations, financial history, the kind of cursory examination that a man runs on a business contact, not the deep excavation he ran on anyone who came near the actual center of his world. Told himself it was a careful arrangement. He'd told himself he was the one in control. Men like Adrian Voss were very good at telling themselves that. The affair, which was how Adrian still thought of it in the most reductive possible sense, had been running for 2 years before Elena found out. He knew she'd found out because she'd stopped asking where he was in the evenings. Elena had always asked not out of jealousy. He understood now, but out of the habit of a woman who wanted to maintain the structure of something even when the structure was mostly facade. When she stopped asking, he'd understood that she knew. He'd waited for the confrontation that didn't come. The confrontation didn't come because Elena was doing something else with that information. He understood this now. He stood at the hospital window in the rain and he turned it over and over, rebuilding the last several months from the other side, and every piece settled differently when he did. Elena closing the library door. Elena moving carefully through rooms. Elena's handwriting on the back of an envelope. "You are not ready to see this yet." She had not been planning to leave. She had been planning something else. Something that required time and evidence, and the kind of patience that Adrian now recognized, with something like awe, as a different version of the same quality he'd spent years cultivating in himself. His phone buzzed. Marcus. Adrian answered it, and walked further from Vivian, keeping his voice low. "Tell me." "Ramirez is gone," Marcus said. "His apartment's been cleaned out. Not packed, cleaned. Professional job. He was gone before the ambulance got there." Adrian absorbed this. The account's still working on it. But early numbers don't look right. There's movement in the secondary holdings, the shell companies under Meridian Group. Someone with internal access initiated transfers starting about 6 weeks ago. How much? Enough to matter. I'll have the full picture in an hour. The envelope I told you about. The flash drive. I have them. Haven't opened anything yet. Waiting on your call. Open them. Tell me what you see. Call me back in 20 minutes. Adrian ended the call. Stood at the window. Behind him he could hear Vivian shift slightly. The sound of her heels on the corridor floor, restless. She'd been watching him since he walked away from her, and she didn't like not being in the conversation. He'd always interpreted her dislike of exclusion as personality. He was reinterpreting it now. He turned around. Vivian was standing near the chairs, her arms folded, her expression arranged into something between concern and impatience. She'd done her makeup at some point. Since arriving, he noticed it now. The precision of it, the complete pulled-together quality of a woman who had prepared for this moment. A woman at a hospital vigil doesn't retouch her makeup unless she's decided this is a performance rather than an emergency. You're working, she said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Adrian. Your wife is in surgery. I'm aware of that. He looked at her steadily. Who called you? What, tonight? To tell you where I was. Who called you? A beat. Small but there a fraction of a second where Vivian's expression did the thing it always did when she was recalibrating, though he'd never properly labeled it before. The tiny mechanical adjustment behind the eyes. You're under an enormous amount of stress. Who called you? I saw it on the news. There were emergency vehicles at the estate. I put it together. Adrian held her gaze for a long moment. Of course, he said. He walked back to the window. The news. There had been no news. Marcus had managed the scene specifically to prevent any media contact, and Adrian knew this because managing that kind of thing was one of the first calls Marcus made. There had been no police presence, another thing that Marcus handled through channels that Adrian paid a great deal of money to maintain. There had been nothing public, nothing that anyone watching a news feed, at whatever hour Vivian claimed to have seen it, would have caught. She'd been told, or she'd known to watch. Adrian pressed one hand flat against the cold glass and breathed through the thing building in his chest and thought about a woman he had trusted with things that a man like him almost never trusted anyone with, and he thought about a library drawer fractionally open, and he thought about 12 minutes of missing security footage, and he thought about his daughter breathing independently 31 weeks, too early in a hospital room somewhere below him. He thought about the note. Don't trust the woman standing beside you. He hadn't seen that note yet. He hadn't found it in the library. The night had moved too fast. But he would learn about it later, from Marcus, who found it tucked inside the second manila envelope. A single index card in Elena's handwriting. No preamble, no date. 7 words that his wife had apparently written at some point in the past several weeks, and placed where she thought he might eventually look. 7 words that she had known, in the careful and deliberate way she had known everything recently that he would eventually need. The NICU nurse's name was Patterson. She found Adrian in the corridor just after 11 p.m. and told him that if he wanted to see his daughter, she could take him now, briefly, assuming he'd follow the protocols. He followed the protocols. He stood over the incubator with his hands at his sides. He'd been told not to touch the glass without asking first, and he looked at his daughter for the first time. She was very small. He'd known she would be small. 31 weeks was the number the doctor had given him, and he understood what that meant in general terms. But the specific reality of her smallness was something he had not been able to prepare for. She had dark hair already, impossibly. Dark hair, and her hands were the size he associated with something miniature and precious and fragile in a way that made his throat constrict. She was breathing. The machinery around her beeped in steady, regular intervals, and Patterson stood a few feet away, giving him space without actually leaving. And Adrian looked at his daughter through the incubator glass for a very long time. He didn't have a name for what he felt. He'd spent decades developing a fluency in power, threat, calculation, controlled rage. Was not any of those things. This was something that the life he'd built for himself had very deliberately excluded, and standing here in the blue-tinged light of the NICU, with his daughter smaller than his forearm, he felt the exclusion as a specific and enormous loss. He hadn't known it was there to lose. He thought about what kind of father he'd intended to be. The answer was uncomfortable. He hadn't intended to be any specific kind. He'd assumed the child would slot into his life the way everything else had, because he'd always been the one who decided how things slotted. He'd assumed there would be time to figure out the rest. He understood now that this was exactly the kind of thinking that had brought him to a 14th floor NICU at 11 at night, standing outside his daughter's incubator while his wife was still in surgery, and a woman he had brought into the center of his life was waiting in a corridor above him, calculating her next move. Phone buzzed. Marcus again. Adrian stepped away from the incubator, far enough to speak quietly without disturbing the room, and answered. "Tell me," he said. Marcus's voice was steady in the careful way it got when the information was bad, and Marcus was being professional about it. "The flash drive has financial documents, shell company structures, correspondence, account numbers. Whoever put this together was thorough at cross-references holdings going back about 4 years. 4 years. Yes, that was a year before Vivian. Someone had been building something before Vivian appeared in his life. Or Vivian had been building something before she appeared in his life. The distinction mattered. The envelopes? One has copies of communications encrypted, but Elena apparently had a key. I've got someone working on the second layer. The other envelope, Marcus paused, which was unusual. Marcus didn't pause. The other envelope has photographs. And a note. What kind of photographs? Meetings. People you would recognize meeting with people they shouldn't be meeting with. Locations, dates. It's documented, the note. Marcus read it. All 7 words. Adrian stood in the NICU, and he listened to his wife's handwriting read back to him in Marcus's careful voice, and he looked through the glass at his daughter's dark hair, and her hands the size of something precious, and he felt something finalize inside him. Not dramatically. Not with the weight of revelation. Just the quiet, irrevocable closing of a door that had been open too long. He knew what he was going to do. He wasn't ready to do it yet. There were things he needed to know first, the full picture from the financial documents, the communications, the photographs. He needed the complete shape of it before he moved, because if he moved wrong, the people who had organized this would scatter, and he would spend years chasing them, and his daughter up in the shadow of unfinished business. He knew how to wait. He'd been waiting, without knowing it, for years. "Marcus," he said quietly, "don't touch anything else tonight. Lock the documents down. I'll be back at the estate by morning." Understood. And Vivian Cross? Adrian glanced back at the incubator. Dark hair, the hands. "Let her think everything is normal," he said. "Good at waiting. So am I." He ended the call. He stood for another minute looking at his daughter. Then he went back upstairs to the corridor where Vivian was waiting, and he sat down in one of the beige chairs, and he looked at his hands, and he waited for his wife to come out of surgery. He waited the way a man waits when he finally understands what's worth waiting for. Outside, the rain continued to fall. Elena came out of surgery at 2:47 in the morning. Adrian knew it before anyone told him, because he heard the doors and he heard the change in the sound of movement beyond them, a deceleration. The specific rhythm of people who had been in crisis mode downstairs into something slower and more deliberate. He was on his feet before Hallberg appeared. Hallberg looked worse than before. His eyes had the flat, used quality of a man who had spent the last several hours making decisions that required a precision his body was no longer naturally producing. He pulled off his surgical cap as he walked toward Adrian and held it in both hands, and Adrian read the gesture the way. He read everything for what it meant beneath the surface of it. She made it through. Adrian breathed once, slowly. The internal bleeding is controlled. We've repaired the damage. She's going to require significant recovery time, we're talking, weeks before she's out of this hospital, and she'll need monitoring long after that. She is alive, Mr. Voss, and her vitals are holding. When can I see her? Not tonight. She's in recovery, heavily sedated. Tomorrow, if she continues to stabilize, we'll move her to a private room, and you can sit with her. Adrian nodded. He was aware that his hands had been balled into fists at his sides for some period of time, and he deliberately opened them. The injuries. Were they consistent with a fall? Hallberg met his eyes. Whatever the doctor was, whatever line he walked between professional obligation and the particular kind of discretion that private hospitals cultivated when their patients were people like Adrian Voss, he was not a stupid man. He understood the question underneath the question. That's outside my area, Mr. Voss. I can tell you what the surgical findings were, and I can tell you what they weren't. He paused. The trauma pattern was not typical for an unassisted fall. The two men looked at each other. "Thank you," Adrian said. Hallberg put his cap back on and went back through the doors. Adrian stood in the corridor. Vivian was behind him. He'd registered her presence without turning. She'd been sitting in the chairs for the past hour, in an unusual silence, the kind that doesn't come from peace but from calculation, from a person conserving themselves for the next required performance. "Thank God," she said. Her voice had the right texture of relief, the right warmth. He'd been listening to her voice for 3 years, and he'd never once heard it slip. And he understood now that this was not naturalness. This was practice. He turned around. "You should go home, Vivian." "I'm not going anywhere. You shouldn't be here alone." "I'm not alone." He gestured minimally toward Croft and the other man at the elevator. "Go home. Get some sleep. I'll call you tomorrow." Beat. She searched his face for something, the entry point she usually found, specific opening in him that she'd learned to navigate. He watched her look for it and not find it, and he kept his expression steady and empty and waited. Adrian. Good night, Vivian. She left. He watched the elevator doors close, and then he sat down in one of the beige chairs for the first time in 6 hours and put his elbows on his knees and his face in his hands and stayed there for a while. Not long. Long enough. Then he called Marcus and told him to have a car ready in 20 minutes. The estate at 3:30 in the morning had the particular quality of a place that had recently been a scene. The Easton was still partially cordoned off his own men, not police. A deliberate choice Marcus had made, and Adrian had ratified without thinking about it earlier in the evening. Now he walked through his own house and looked at it differently. He walked through rooms he'd occupied for 9 years and felt the walls differently, the way you feel them in a house you're about to leave. He went directly to the library. Marcus was already there, waiting, seated at the desk with the 3 envelopes in the flash drive and a laptop and 2 cups of coffee. He slid 1 cup toward Adrian without comment. Adrian picked it up, took a swallow, and sat in Elena's reading chair. "Show me," he said. Marcus opened the first envelope. The financial documents were meticulous. Whoever Elena had worked with, because someone had helped her compile this, Adrian could see it in the structure, the cross-referencing, the specific legal terminology that Elena was intelligent enough to understand, but wouldn't have generated it alone. They understood how shell company architecture worked, and more importantly, how it unraveled. The Meridian Group, which Adrian had established 8 years ago as a legitimate holding entity, had been used as a conduit, not by Adrian, by someone with the access codes and the internal knowledge to move quietly through the secondary layers. The transfers had started 4 years ago. Small amounts initially, the kind that fell below the threshold of anything Marcus's quarterly audits would catch. Then progressively larger. Then, in the past 6 weeks, the 6 weeks Marcus had flagged significant. The kind of significant that represented the endgame of a 4-year accumulation. Who had access to the Meridian accounts? Adrian asked. He already had a working answer. He wanted to hear it from Marcus. At the level these transfers required, Marcus leaned back. 4 people. You, me. Hendricks from the financial side, who I'm already looking at. He paused. And whoever held the secondary administrator key, which was set up 3 years ago. When Vivian came in, Adrian set down the coffee cup. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, and then picked up the second envelope. The photographs were printed on standard paper. Elena, or her source, had been careful about not using anything that could be traced through photographic paper stock. 17 images. Adrian went through them slowly, the way you go through evidence when the evidence concerns your own life. The first 4 he recognized immediately as meetings he himself had attended different participants, same locations, legitimate business. Context was being established. The next 6 were different. He recognized 2 of the faces immediately. One was a man named Gareth Cole, who ran a competing operation in the northern districts, and whom Adrian had been in careful, hostile equilibrium with for years. The other was a financial lawyer named Pruitt, who had no business being in the same room as Gareth Cole, under any circumstances Adrian could construct that didn't indicate something seriously wrong. Vivian was in 3 of the photographs. She was careful in them, positioned at angles, partially obscured, the body language of a woman who understood cameras and sightlines. But Elena, or Elena's source, had been patient. The images were clear enough. The dates stamped in the corner of each print spanned 14 months. 14 months, Adrian said. Yes, he set the photographs down. He picked up the 3rd envelope and found the index card inside, and read his wife's handwriting, and then set that to carefully, like it was something that could be damaged. He sat in Elena's chair in Elena's library and looked at the desk that had been his father's, and he thought about a woman who had looked at him across this house for 9 years and known, probably for longer than he deserved, that something was wrong. A woman who had recently decided to do something about it. A woman who was alive right now because a surgeon had spent 3 hours keeping her that way. The 3rd name, he said, the secondary administrator key. Give me the name, Marcus. Marcus looked at him. We don't have confirmation yet. Give me the working theory. Vivian Cross doesn't have the technical background to set up that kind of account access herself. But she has a brother, Roland Cross, financial technology background, worked in banking infrastructure for 8 years before he dropped off the professional record about 4 years ago. 4 years ago. Find him, Adrian said, working on it. And Ramirez, the missing guard. I need to know who he's been in contact with for the past 6 months. Every number, every physical meeting, everything. I've got a team on it. Adrian stood up. carried his coffee to the window, and stood there, looking out at the grounds, the dark lawn, the trees along the north wall, the places where his security lights created hard lines between visibility and shadow. He'd built all of this, every wall, every camera, every protocol. He'd built a structure that was supposed to make the people inside it safe, and the people in it had not been safe. And the reason they had not been safe was that the danger had been inside the structure from the beginning. How long have you been working for me, Marcus? 11 years. Have I ever asked you to do something you couldn't live with? Marcus considered this with the seriousness it deserved. No, I'm going to ask you to work very carefully on what comes next. Not fast, carefully. I need the complete picture before anything moves. Can you do that? Yes. Then go. Keep me updated every 2 hours. And Marcus, Adrian didn't turn from the window. Nobody knows what's in those documents. Not yet, not until I say so. Understood. Marcus left. Adrian stayed at the window until the sky started to change. He was back at the hospital by 8 in the morning. Elena had been moved to a private room on the 12th floor. She was still sedated, connected to monitors that recorded everything in steady green lines. Adrian sat in the chair beside her bed and looked at his wife's face, the bruising along her jaw, the IV lines in her arm, the oxygen monitor on her finger, and he stayed there for 2 hours without his phone. Longest he'd gone without his phone in probably 10 years. He looked at her hands. They were still. The same stillness as the ambulance, but different now. This was the stillness of a body healing rather than a body failing. And he was grateful for the distinction in a way he didn't have adequate language for. He thought about what she had been doing, the patience of it, the months of gathering, of building a case, of writing notes on index cards and locking envelopes in desk drawers. Elena had not been a woman who trusted easily. He'd always known this about her. It was one of the things that had made her, paradoxically, one of the only people in his life he'd actually trusted. She observed, she waited. She made her moves when she was certain. She had been more like him than he'd ever acknowledged. He thought about the baby. He'd arranged to have a nurse from the NICU send him updates every 2 hours overnight. All stable. The dark hair, the small hands. He'd been told he could visit again this afternoon. His phone, which he'd allowed back into his possession at 9, buzzed. Vivian. He looked at the screen, let it ring. Looked at Elena. Let it go to whatever she thought was voicemail. 3 minutes later, a text. Adrian, I need to talk to you. I know that sounds wrong given everything that's happening, but there are things you need to hear from me before you hear them from other people. Please. He read the message twice. Before you hear them from other people. There it was. The signal that someone had told her the documents existed, or that she'd always known the documents might exist, and was now calculating that Elena's survival meant the timeline had accelerated. It was the message of a person who wanted to get to the story first. He typed back, "Come to the house tonight, 8 o'clock. He put the phone down and looked at Elena. "I'm going to handle it," he said quietly. He wasn't sure why he said it out loud. She couldn't hear him. But it felt necessary, the way certain things feel necessary when you've been conducting yourself incorrectly for a long time, and you're attempting, clumsily, to begin correcting it. He had 6 calls by noon. 3 from business associates who had heard some version of the previous night's events through channels he couldn't immediately trace. 1 from his attorney, Bassett, who was careful and expensive, and wanted to know if there was anything Adrian needed managed. 1 from a man named Delaney, who ran the Northern Port operation, and who asked about Elena with a warmth that felt slightly off, the way warmth always feels when it's been deployed, rather than felt. The 6th was from a number he didn't recognize. He answered it because of the previous night. Unknown numbers had taken on a different weight. A man's voice. Older, controlled with the specific flatness of someone who had learned not to let regional accent show. "You don't know me. My name is Carver. I worked with your wife." Adrian was very still. "I helped her compile what she found," Carver continued. "I'm not going to tell you how or why yet. What I'm going to tell you is that there's a piece of it she didn't have time to give you. A piece that changes the shape of the rest." "What piece?" "Not on this line. I know where you are. I can be at the hospital in 40 minutes if you'll see me." Every instinct Adrian Voss had developed over 11 years of operating in the specific ecosystem he operated in told him this was a variable he hadn't controlled for, and uncontrolled variables in moments of vulnerability were how people got hurt. He'd been hurt. His wife had been hurt. He was aware that the correct response to an unknown person requesting a meeting might be to decline and have Marcus find out who Carver was first. He was also aware that he didn't have the luxury of the slower process right now. 40 minutes, he said. "Lobby." He told Croft, who went downstairs to make arrangements that would make a meeting in the lobby safe enough. Then he told Marcus to run the name Carver, no first name. Older male voice, specific vocal qualities he described against every database Marcus had access to, which was more databases than most people knew existed. Marcus called back in 22 minutes. Thomas Carver, 3, former federal financial crimes investigator. Retired 8 years ago, went private. Consulting work in financial forensics, mostly civil cases. Clean record, no flags. He filed a missing persons report for a niece 3 years ago she was found. The report was closed. Marcus paused. He has no recorded connection to Elena, but 8 months ago, there's a gap in his activity. He stopped showing up in any of the professional contexts we'd expect for about 6 weeks. Starts back up. 8 months ago was when, Adrian now calculated, Elena had probably begun building the case in earnest. He's who he says he is, Adrian said. Looks like it. Thomas Carver arrived at the hospital lobby at exactly the 40-minute mark. Adrian watched him cross the lobby from a position that allowed him to see, without being immediately seen, a habit, like all his habits, that had never entirely served him, and that he couldn't entirely drop. Carver was what the voice had suggested, older, contained, wearing a gray coat that had been good once and was now past that. He moved like someone who had spent years being inconspicuous professionally and had not stopped. They sat in a corner of the lobby that Croft had cleared of the 2 other occupants with minimal drama. Adrian did not offer his hand. Carver didn't expect him to. She came to me 9 months ago, Carver said without preamble. He had the cadence of a man who had given briefings before and understood that people in Adrian's position didn't want contextualizing. They wanted sequence. She found an anomaly in your financial documents. She wasn't sure what it meant. She'd been watching it for a while before she reached out. How did she find you? Through a contact. I don't expose contacts. She came to me with a partial picture, and I helped her build the rest. You ran an investigation on me, on your financial structures. There's a distinction. Carver's eyes were steady and gray and didn't perform anything. What we found wasn't you. You need to understand that whatever Elena told you or left for you to find, the thing she was building was not a case against you. Adrian held very still. Then who? The woman has a name for herself in certain circles. Carver reached into his coat and produced a single folded sheet of paper and placed it on the seat between them without sliding it toward Adrian. Just placed it. Available. She came in close to you 3 years ago. Before that, she was affiliated with a network that operates in 3 cities' financial infiltration. Long game. They identify high-value targets in legitimate adjacent criminal enterprises, and they move assets. Takes years. They're patient. She was sent. The word landed in Adrian's chest the way a specific kind of truth lands, not like a revelation, but like the confirmation of something the body already knows. He looked at the paper on the seat. He didn't pick it up yet. Piece Elena didn't have time to give me, he said. What is it? Carver looked at him for a moment. He had the eyes of a man who had sat across from a great number of people who did not want to hear what he was about to say. She wasn't just taking your money. The financial operation was the secondary objective. He paused. The primary objective was the child. Adrian's breathing shifted. There's a pattern in the network's history, 3 previous operations. In each case, the long-game infiltration included a pregnancy. The child becomes leverage. Sometimes it's used, sometimes it's sufficient threat. The important thing from their perspective is that it exists. A biological child in the right legal position creates complications that money can't always solve, and that keeps a man. Carver chose his next word deliberately, compliant. The lobby was very quiet. Elena knew this, Adrian said. Elena suspected it. She didn't have the confirmation. I do. He nodded toward the paper. That's the network documentation. The previous cases, the pattern. Adrian picked up the paper. He read it slowly. His hands were steady. He was aware that they were steady in the specific way that hands are steady when everything inside the body is doing something that precludes trembling when the interior conditions are too serious for external performance of any kind. 3 previous cases, 3 men. 2 had lost everything through legal maneuvering centered on custody and paternity claims. 1 had simply disappeared from public record entirely, which could mean several things, none of them good. He folded the paper carefully and put it in his jacket pocket. Why are you telling me this? He said. You were working for my wife. My wife is unconscious. I was working for your wife, Carver agreed. But she told me, before any of this happened, what she wanted the outcome to be. She wasn't interested in destroying you, Mr. Voss. She was interested in protecting the baby. He let that sit. She was very clear about that. Whatever happened between you 2 and I don't know, and didn't ask. She wanted the child to be safe. Adrian was quiet. There's something else, Carver said. Tell me. Vivian Cross knows Elena survived. Someone at this hospital told someone, and it got back to her within 4 hours of the surgery ending. I mean, she knows the timeline has changed. She was operating on the assumption that last night went the way she wanted it to go. Adrian stared at him. You're saying she expected Elena to die. I'm saying the plan didn't account for Elena surviving. Carver held his gaze. Which means she's going to move fast now. Whatever she's been building toward the financial transfers, the leverage around the child she's going to accelerate. She can't afford to let you get fully oriented. Adrian thought about the text message. Before you hear them from other people. He thought about the meeting he'd agreed to. 8 o'clock tonight. He now understood, handed Vivian Cross a window and told her the exact time to use it. Stood up. How do I reach you? He said. Carver produced a card, plain white, a phone number, nothing else. Anytime. Adrian took it. He looked at the man for a moment with the specific assessment he'd been applying to people his entire adult life, the quick, comprehensive read that told him whether someone was what they appeared to be. Carver was. He'd staked enough of himself on less. He walked back toward the elevator. In the elevator, alone. Going up, he pulled out his phone and called Marcus. Change of plans on tonight, he said when Marcus answered. I need you inside the estate before 7. Full setup, I want everything recorded, every room she goes near. And I need Hendricks brought in separately, quietly. He's going to tell me everything he knows about the secondary Meridian administrator, or he's going to have a very uncomfortable night. Done, Marcus said. Anything else? Adrian thought about a woman in a gray hospital room with IV lines in her arm. He thought about a premature baby with dark hair. He thought about the specific shape of a plan that had been running for 4 years, patient and invisible, through the structure of everything he'd built. Find Roland Cross, he said. Tonight, before 8. He ended the call as the elevator doors opened on the 12th floor. He walked back to Elena's room and sat down beside her again. Outside the window, it was a clear afternoon, the rain entirely gone, the kind of light that made everything look more definite than it was. Adrian watched the light move across the floor, and he thought about what Carver had said. Primary objective was the child. His daughter was in this building. He looked at Elena's still hands, and he made himself a promise, quiet, private. The kind of promise that doesn't need to be said aloud, to be real, that he would not leave this hospital tonight without making sure that every person between Vivian Cross and that NICU room understood exactly what it would cost them to let her through. He was still thinking when his phone lit up with Marcus's message, found Roland Cross. He's not alone. You need to see this. Adrian stood, picked up his jacket, and walked out of the room toward whatever came next. The door to every version of the life he'd been living, swinging shut behind him with a finality he didn't bother to look back at. Marcus's message had 4 words after the first sentence. He's not alone. You need to see this. And then a location, a warehouse address in the industrial district on the east side of the city, 40 minutes from the hospital. A neighborhood, Adrian knew the way. He knew all the neighborhoods his business had ever touched by the specific texture of what happened there after dark. Adrian was in the car in 4 minutes. Croft drove. The city moved past the windows in the flat afternoon light, and Adrian sat in the back seat with Carver's folded paper in his jacket pocket and Marcus's message on his screen, and the particular kind of stillness that comes not from calm, but from mind running very fast on the inside while the body conserves itself for what's coming. He called Marcus on the way. How many, he said. 3 men with Roland Cross. One of them I recognized, Sutter. He ran logistics for Cole's operation in the Northern District 18 months ago before Cole restructured. Gareth Cole, the same name from Elena's photographs. The man who had no business meeting with Vivian's financial lawyer, who had apparently also provided personnel. Is Roland talking? Adrian asked. Not yet. He doesn't know we have him. We're watching from outside. I didn't want to move without you. Good. Keep it that way. He ended the call and looked out the window and thought about the shape of it. Cole's network providing manpower, Vivian providing internal access and the relationship with Adrian, Roland Cross providing the financial architecture. 3 moving parts, each one knowing only what it needed to know, the whole picture visible only from the position Adrian was currently occupying. Elena had seen it. That was what the documents proved. She'd stood inside the house, with all of it happening around her, and she'd seen the shape of it before anyone expected her to. He thought about that for the rest of the drive and didn't say anything else. The warehouse was a low concrete building behind a chain-link fence, the kind of structure that existed in large numbers in that part of the city, without attracting attention precisely because there were so many of them, and they all looked the same. Marcus had 3 men positioned around the perimeter in ways that were not visible from the street. He met Adrian at the fence line, and walked him through the situation in the direct, sequential way Marcus briefed everything facts first, interpretation second, recommendation third, all of it offered without performance. Roland Cross was inside with his 3 associates. They'd arrived 2 hours ago. One of the associates had left briefly and returned with food, which suggested they were planning to be there a while. No weapons visible on entry, though that didn't mean much. The building had 2 exits, and both were covered. They're expecting someone else, Marcus said. Roland made 2 calls in the past hour, both to the same number. The number routes to a prepaid, but the cell tower data puts it in the vicinity of the hospital. The vicinity of the hospital. Adrian looked at the warehouse. Vivian, he said, that's my read. She was supposed to come to the estate at 8. She'd agreed to it. Sent a confirmation text, I'll be there. And Adrian had assumed she would come and walk into the recorded environment he'd prepared and say whatever she was going to say under conditions he controlled. He'd assumed he was still managing the pace. He understood now that the 8 o'clock meeting had been her buying time. She wasn't coming to the estate. She was coming here or sending direction here or both. We go in now, Adrian said. There's a complication. Marcus kept his voice level. He had a tell when information was genuinely bad. A slight tightening around the jaw that he'd never managed to entirely eliminate. It was there now. One of the calls Roland made, I had the audio pulled. He said the name. He said Elena's name. And then he said the room number. Adrian went very still. He has Elena's room number. Yes. The thing in Adrian's chest that had been cold since the hospital corridor became something else. Not cold. The opposite of cold. He turned to Croft. Get back to the hospital. Find Patterson, the NICU nurse. She'll know who to contact for the 12th floor. Elena's room is not to be entered by anyone who isn't on a list that you personally approve. You understand? Nobody. Not hospital administration. Not someone claiming to be family. Nobody. Croft was already moving. Adrian turned back to the warehouse. Let's go, he said. Roland Cross was not what Adrian had expected, which was itself information. Adrian had constructed a mental image based on Marcus's description, financial technology background, the kind of man who built invisible structures and stayed invisible himself. And the reality sat differently. Roland's was 40, or close to it, and he had the look of someone who had once been disciplined about his physical condition and had let it slide in the past couple of years. The soft edges of a man whose work had become sedentary and whose stress had found its outlet in things other than the gym. He was sitting at a folding table with a laptop open and a half-eaten sandwich beside it when Adrian's men came through both doors simultaneously. And the expression on Roland's face in that first second before the survival calculation kicked in and rearranged it into something more controlled was not fear. It was recognition. The recognition of a man who has been expecting something like this and has not managed to prepare for it adequately despite the expectation. The 3 associates made movements that were stopped cleanly and without drama by Marcus's men. Roland didn't move at all. He sat at the table and watched Adrian cross the warehouse floor and pull a chair from the stack against the wall and set it down across from him and sit. Roland Cross, Adrian said. Mr. Voss. Roland's voice had the flatness of someone performing composure. His hands were flat on the table on either side of the laptop, which was a posture of deliberate non-threat. And Adrian noted it, the way he noted everything as a choice that said something about what Roland had been told about this moment. You know why I'm here, I can guess. Then save us both time. Roland looked at him. He had Vivian's eyes, not the color, but the quality. The same mechanism behind them, the continuous processing, the assessment of exits and options. Vivian was better at concealing it. Roland, under pressure and without the preparation time Vivian always gave herself, let it show more plainly. I want a lawyer, Roland said. Adrian looked at him for a long, quiet moment. This isn't that kind of conversation. Roland's jaw tightened. The Meridian accounts, Adrian said. The secondary administrator key. That was you, silence. I'm not asking if it was you, Adrian said. I already know it was you. I'm asking you to help me understand the sequence, because right now I'm working from what my wife put together, and your sister is going to walk through a door somewhere in the next few hours, having made a decision she doesn't fully understand the consequences of yet. And I would like to know the complete shape of this before that happens. Roland looked at the table. The room number, Adrian said. Elena's room number. You gave that to someone. Who? Nothing. Adrian leaned forward slightly. His voice didn't change volume. Roland. I have a daughter in the NICU in that hospital who is 31 weeks old and breathing through equipment. I have a wife in a room on the 12th floor who is alive because a surgeon spent 3 hours making her that way. Someone in your network arranged for her to go down those stairs. That is where we are. He paused. Now I'm going to ask you one more time. The room number. Who did you give it to? Roland's breathing had changed. His hands on the table were very still, in the way hands are still when the body is managing something difficult. Sutter, he said. His voice was quieter than before. I gave it to Sutter. He was going to pass it up. Up to Vivian. A pause then, up to Cole. The name dropped into the space between them and sat there. Adrian looked at Roland Cross and understood several things simultaneously. He understood that Vivian, whatever her role in the construction of this, was not the top of it. He understood that Gareth Cole, whom he'd been in careful hostile equilibrium with for years, had not been in equilibrium at all, had been running a parallel operation inside Adrian's own structure, while maintaining the performance of a rival rather than an enemy. He understood that the 4 years of careful financial architecture, the 3 years of Vivian, the months of Roland's access work, all of it had been moving towards something that was not simply asset acquisition. Carver had told him. The primary objective was the child, the leverage, the compliance. Cole didn't want his money. Cole wanted him controllable. A man with a daughter in the NICU could be controlled in ways that a man without one could not. Where is Cole? Adrian said. I don't know. That's the wrong answer. I genuinely don't know. I never met him directly. Everything went through Vivian or through intermediaries. That's how they structured it. Nobody has the full picture, except Roland stopped. Except who? Roland looked at him with the expression of a man calculating how much of himself he can spend and still have something left. Except Vivian. She's the only one who's met him directly. She coordinated everything at the top level. I was the financial layer. Sutter was logistics. She was the connection to Cole. Adrian sat back. He looked at the laptop on the table. Is that connected to the operation? Roland hesitated. Then yes. Give Marcus the passwords, all of them. Everything. Roland closed his eyes briefly. It was the gesture of a man surrendering something he understands he won't get back. Then he opened them and looked at Marcus and started talking. Adrian stood, walked away from the table, and called Croft. Status, he said. 12th floor is locked down, Croft said. I've got 2 men on the door. Nobody in or out without the list. The NICU, Patterson's been briefed. She's got security on both access points. Good. Stay where you are. He ended the call. He walked to the far end of the warehouse, where a grimy window looked out at the chain-link fence and the empty street beyond it. The afternoon was fading. In 3 hours it would be 8 o'clock, and Vivian would not be coming to the estate, because Vivian had never intended to come to the estate. He pulled out his phone and looked at her last message. I'll be there. He typed back, running late at the hospital. Can we push to 9? He sent it and waited. 40 seconds later, of course. Take your time. The performance of accommodation. The warmth of a woman who had spent 3 years learning to produce exactly the sounds and words that worked on him. He put the phone away. Behind him, he could hear Roland Cross giving Marcus passwords in the careful, defeated voice of a man who has made his calculation and chosen survival over loyalty, which in Adrian's experience was what most people chose when the moment actually came, regardless of what they believed about themselves beforehand. He stood at the window and he thought about Gareth Cole, whose location he did not have, who had been running an operation inside his life for 4 years. Thought about the fact that he'd been the last person to understand what had been happening to him that Elena had understood before him, that Carver had built documentation before him, that his wife had been leaving him maps in desk drawers and index cards in envelopes while he'd been sitting 2 floors above her, in his study not asking questions. He thought about what it meant that the plan had required his daughter, the leverage, the compliance mechanism. A man with a child he loves can be made to do things that a man without a child will not do, and the love doesn't even have to have existed before the child was born. It just has to exist now, in the moment when the threat is made. Adrian had stood over that incubator for 4 minutes, and in those 4 minutes, something had formed in him that hadn't been there before, and whoever had designed this had understood that this was how it would go. They'd bet on his humanity as a weapon against him. He found this enraging in a way that clarified everything. He walked back to the table. Roland was finishing a sequence of passwords for Marcus. He looked up at Adrian with the careful watchfulness of a man uncertain about his immediate future. Plan, Adrian said. Walk me through the endgame. What was supposed to happen after last night? Roland's expression shifted. I only knew my piece. Walk me through your piece. Breath. Roland pulled his hands off the table and folded them in his lap, a repositioning that said he was settling into something he'd rather not settle into. The financial transfer's complete when certain conditions are met. Triggers. Legal conditions. What legal conditions? Custody or guardianship of the child. He set it to the table. The structure is set up, So that if Vivian establishes any legal relationship to the child, even a minor one, even a contested one, that takes months to resolve, the transferred assets become inaccessible to you through standard legal channels. They're in jurisdictions that don't cooperate with domestic legal action. Adrian stared at him. It's not about the money, Roland said quietly. The money is almost secondary. The structure is designed to create a situation where you spend years in legal process while the real leverage operates. Cole's people would approach you at some point during that process. Compliance conversation, and if I didn't comply. Roland looked up for the first time in several minutes. His eyes had something in them that was close to discomfort, which was interesting given everything else he'd just said. Then the legal situation around the child becomes permanent rather than temporary. That's all I know. That's all you know. Yes. Adrian looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned to Marcus. Is it enough? What he's given you, is it enough to document the whole structure? Marcus was working through something on the laptop. Give me another 20 minutes. You have 10. He walked back to the window. The thing that was unfolding in him now was not the rage he would have expected, not the cold violence he'd built a career on, not the controlled lethality that had characterized 11 years of operating in the world he'd chosen. This was something different, quieter and more fundamental. It was the feeling of a man who has been powerful for a very long time suddenly understanding that the power was never the point, that the power had in fact been the mechanism by which he'd been made vulnerable, because power accumulates enemies and enemies plan and plans require time, and he had given them years. He had given them years because he hadn't been paying attention to the right things. Phone buzzed. He looked at the screen expecting Croft or Marcus. It was a number he didn't recognize. He answered Adrian, a man's voice. Measured, slightly graveled, the voice of someone in his 50s who had long ago stopped needing to perform authority, because authority had become natural. We haven't spoken directly before. I think it's time. Everything in Adrian went quiet. Cole, he said. You've had a productive afternoon, the voice said. I heard you found Roland. He's a good financial mind, but he's not built for pressure. I always knew he'd be the weak point. Adrian's hand was entirely steady around the phone. Where are you? Close enough to know what's happening. Far enough to be comfortable. A pause. I want you to understand something, Adrian. This doesn't have to be a war. That was never the design. The design was a business arrangement, mutual benefit, sustainable long-term. You have assets I find useful. I have reach and capability that would benefit someone in your position considerably. You had my wife push down a staircase. A brief silence. When Cole spoke again, the measured quality was intact, but something underneath it had shifted almost imperceptibly. That was a deviation from the plan. That wasn't sanctioned. Whose deviation? Vivian made a judgment call that I wouldn't have made. She panicked when she found out how much Elena had compiled. She acted without authorization. Another pause. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand the distinction. Adrian looked at the warehouse wall. He was aware of Marcus behind him, of Roland Cross at the table, of the 10-minute deadline he'd given Marcus that was now running. He was aware of everything in the room, and he was also aware of how completely and precisely he'd been wrong about the nature of the situation he was in. Not wrong about Vivian, not wrong about the financial structure, but wrong about the scale. He'd been thinking about a woman and a scheme. He'd been inside a machinery. What do you want? Adrian said. A conversation, in person. Tonight. Cole gave an address, not the warehouse, somewhere else, across the city. Come alone. No Marcus, no Croft, no security. I'll know if you bring anyone, and I'll know within 30 seconds, and the conversation we need to have won't happen. And if I don't come, then tomorrow morning your daughter's legal status becomes very complicated, and the process I described to Roland begins, and we spend the next several years in a situation that's unpleasant for everyone involved, and ultimately ends the same way regardless. A pause. Or you come tonight, we talk like adults, and we find an arrangement that works. Adrian was quiet. I'll give you 20 minutes to think about it, Cole said. Then I need an answer. The line went dead. Adrian lowered the phone. He stood absolutely still for approximately 10 seconds. Then he turned around. Marcus was watching him from the table. Roland Cross was watching him. Everyone in the room was watching him with the specific attention of people who have just seen something happen to someone else that they don't fully understand. Called you, Marcus said. It wasn't a question. What does he want? Adrian looked at the phone in his hand. He thought about the address Cole had given. He thought about the instruction to come alone, which was either a genuine condition of a conversation Cole wanted to have, or a mechanism for removing Adrian from the protection of his own security in a vulnerable moment, or both things simultaneously. He thought about his daughter in the NICU, the dark hair, the hands. He thought about compliance and what it would actually require of him. Not just tonight, not just this meeting, the years of it. The arrangement that Cole described as mutual benefit, and that Adrian recognized, with the precision of a man who had run leverage operations himself, as the permanent conversion of Gareth Cole's enemy into Gareth Cole's instrument. He thought about Elena's handwriting on an index card. He thought about the kind of man his daughter would find, eventually at the center of her life. He made a decision. "Marcus," he said, "I need you to do something, and I need you to do it in the next 15 minutes, and it has to be done correctly." "Tell me," Adrian told him. Marcus listened without interrupting. When Adrian finished, Marcus was quiet for 3 seconds, which was, for Marcus, a significant pause. Then he said, "If you do this, there's no version of the next few years that looks like anything you've planned." "I know, the Empire, Marcus." Marcus looked at him. The two men had been working together for 11 years. Marcus had seen Adrian in rooms that required things of both of them that neither of them had ever discussed afterward. He knew Adrian's methods and Adrian's mind in the specific way that a person knows someone they have trusted with the worst version of themselves. Marcus said, "And Roland." Adrian looked at Roland Cross, who had been watching this exchange with the expression of a man trying to determine whether his decision to cooperate had been the right one. "You're going to stay here tonight. My men are going to stay with you. You're not under threat. But you're not going anywhere either, because tomorrow you're going to tell everything you just told me and everything on that laptop to people with the authority to do something with it. Do you understand?" Roland swallowed. "Yes, good." Adrian walked to the warehouse door. "The meeting," Marcus said behind him. Cole's address. "You're going." "I'm going," Adrian said. "Alone. Alone." He pushed the door open. The evening air was cooler than the afternoon had been, the sky a dark blue at the edges where the light was leaving. But Marcus, "Yes, make the calls first, before anything else." "In the next 15 minutes, I will." "Oh." Adrian walked out through the door into the cooling evening, and toward the car, and toward whatever Cole's address contained, which might be a conversation, and might be something else entirely. And he understood, as he walked, that he was operating without a net, for the first time in 11 years, that the protective structure of his power, such as it was in the process of being dismantled by his own instruction. And that what came next would happen to a man who was no longer what he had been this morning. Because this morning's man could not navigate what tonight required. The engine turned over. The city received him. And somewhere across it, Gareth Cole was waiting in a room, comfortable in the belief that Adrian Voss would arrive, as a man who could still be made to calculate, and he had no way of knowing yet what kind of man was actually coming through that door. The address Cole had given was a restaurant, not a warehouse, not a back room in some industrial building, not the kind of location Adrian would have chosen for this kind of meeting. A restaurant, closed for the evening, private booking, the kind of place that cost enough per plate that its discretion was part of the service. Adrian pulled up in a car he'd taken from the estate pool rather than his usual vehicle, a practical choice, not a symbolic one, and sat for a moment looking at the lit windows and the single man visible through the glass, standing near the bar. Cole had picked the restaurant deliberately. A public adjacent space where violence was architecturally discouraged, where the setting itself communicated a preference for conversation over confrontation. Space that said, "I'm not afraid of you." Adrian got out of the car. He was searched at the door by a man whose professionalism was evident in the economy of the process, thorough, fast, no theater. They took the phone he'd expected them to take, a secondary phone he'd prepared for exactly this, and waved him through. The real phone was back in the car. Marcus had made the calls. He held on to that. The restaurant interior was the way expensive restaurants look after hours, chairs still orderly. The ghost of the dinner service in the smell of the room. Lighting turned down to something that flattered the space without illuminating it fully. Gareth Cole was standing at the bar with a glass of something amber and the specific posture of a man entirely comfortable with power, which was different from the posture of a man performing comfort with power. Cole was the real thing. Adrian recognized it because he'd spent years being it. Cole was older than the mental image Adrian had constructed mid-50s, heavy-set in the way that suggested former physicality redirected into mass, gray at the temples and through the close-cut beard. He had the face of a man who had been good-looking in his 30s and had let time convert that into something more durable. He looked at Adrian across the restaurant with the calm attention of someone who had been waiting without impatience. "Adrian Voss," Cole said, not a greeting, an identification. Adrian walked toward him without hurrying. His eyes moved across the room, two men positioned near the back exit, one near the kitchen door, both visible and not attempting to be otherwise. A fourth man near the front that Adrian had clocked on entry. 4 total that he could see, which probably meant 6. He sat at the bar without being invited to. He didn't take a drink. Cole watched him settle and then took a slow swallow from his glass. You came alone, you asked me to. I know what I asked. I'm noting that you did it. He set the glass down. A man who comes alone to this kind of meeting is either very well protected in ways I can't see, or he's made a decision that changes his calculus. He studied Adrian with the directness of someone who doesn't bother with peripheral approach. Which is it? Both, Adrian said. Cole made a sound that was almost a laugh. Not quite. All right. I respect the honesty. He turned to face Adrian more fully, resting one elbow on the bar. You had a bad night last night. I want to acknowledge that before we talk business. What happened to your wife was not part of my design. You said that on the phone. I'm saying it to your face now, because I want you to hear the difference between a phone call and a man telling you directly. Cole's eyes were steady, dark, attentive, the kind of eyes that cataloged rather than felt. Vivian acted outside my authorization. She is going to face consequences for that through my own processes. I want you to know that the line was crossed without my approval. Adrian looked at him. The line, he said. Yes, the line that didn't include putting a woman at the bottom of a staircase. But it did include, Adrian said, his voice completely flat and controlled, using my child as a leverage mechanism. That line was fine. Something moved through Cole's expression. Not guilt. Not quite. The acknowledgement of a man who has compartmentalized a thing so thoroughly that having it named directly requires a small internal reorganization. The structure around the child was designed to be non-harmful. Legal positioning. A pressure mechanism, not a threat to the child's safety. You designed a structure around my daughter before she was born, Adrian said. You put her in the architecture of a scheme before she took her first breath, and you're making a distinction about the line. Cole was quiet for a moment. Yes, he said finally, I am, because in my business distinctions matter. The alternative to distinctions is chaos, and chaos costs everyone. He picked up his glass again. I've been in this work for a long time, Adrian. I didn't get to where I am by being indiscriminate. There are things I do and things I don't do. What Vivian did last night falls in the second category. Adrian said nothing now. Cole's tone shifted into something more direct, the way a man shifts gears. You've had time to look at what your wife put together. You've talked to Roland. You understand the financial structure. So you know that the asset transfers that have been accumulating for 4 years are in positions that you cannot recover through any legal process available to you. He paused. You also know, I think, that I'm not interested in destroying you. A destroyed Adrian Voss is worth nothing to me. What I want is what I said on the phone in arrangement. You operate. I have access to certain distribution channels and legal infrastructure that your operation has built. We both benefit. We don't spend the next several years in a war that costs both sides more than the prize is worth. Adrian sat with this for a moment. Tell me something, he said. Ask the 3 men before me. The operations that followed this same pattern. He watched Cole's face. What happened to them? Cole didn't look away. One retired. He's living quietly in another country. Comfortable. The arrangement worked for him once he stopped resisting it. The second, legal complications that took a few years to resolve. He's still in the process. It's been unpleasant for him. And the third, a beat, shorter than Cole probably intended. The third made choices that narrowed his options. Dead, Adrian said. His situation became untenable through his own decisions. Adrian looked at this man, who spoke about the deaths of people in the passive voice of accounting. He looked at the gray at Cole's temples and the glass in his hand, and the 4 visible men positioned around the restaurant. And he thought about the word arrangement and what it meant over a long enough timeline, and he felt something settle in him that had been unsettled since the hospital corridor. Not peace. Something harder than peace. A kind of finality. I have a question for you, Adrian said. Go ahead. The financial transfers. The accounts in the offshore jurisdictions. They're in Roland's architecture, correct? The access structure he built. Cole's expression didn't change, but something in his stillness shifted almost imperceptibly. And Roland built access requirements, multi-party authentication, meaning you need Roland's authorization codes to actually move or liquidate those assets. Pause. Shorter than it should have been. We have Roland's cooperation. Roland is currently in a warehouse across the city, Adrian said, being very cooperative with the people I left him with. The room changed temperature. Cole's glass came down on the bar, with a sound that was controlled but not entirely. His eyes sharpened in a way that showed for the first time what lived underneath the managed surface. You moved on Roland tonight. I did. That was Cole stopped. Started. You understand what you've just told me. I know exactly what I've told you. Cole looked at him with an expression that had shed the performance of civility like a coat. Underneath it was something older and harder, and considerably more honest. You came here knowing that. You sat down at this bar knowing that. Yes, then you didn't come to negotiate. No, Adrian said. I didn't. Cole was very still for approximately 2 seconds. Then he said quietly, and without looking away from Adrian, a single word. 2 men near the back moved. Adrian was off the bar stool before the word finished. Moving left? Because left was toward the kitchen door, and the man near the kitchen door was the nearest single obstacle rather than the 2 coming from the back. And in any environment with multiple threats, the first calculation is always geometry. He hit the kitchen door with his shoulder rather than his hands, burst through it into the industrial light of the kitchen, beyond empty, post-service, stainless steel surfaces reflecting him in multiples, and moved toward the back of the kitchen, because there was a service exit. There was always a service exit in a restaurant of this size, and Marcus had told him where it was, because Marcus had pulled the building plans that afternoon, before any of this began. He heard movement behind him, through the kitchen door, 2 sets of footsteps, neither of them slow. He was not a young man. He was 44 and he'd spent the last 2 decades in offices and cars rather than in the field, and he felt his age in the specific way you feel it when you're running not badly, not prohibitively, but there. The body reporting in. He found the service exit a steel door with a push bar and hit it, and came out into the alley behind the restaurant, where Marcus was waiting. Marcus and 4 men positioned the way. Marcus positioned things efficiently and without waste. And 2 other vehicles, which were not Marcus's, which had arrived separately, and which contained people whose authority came from a different source, and whose presence here was the result of the calls Marcus had made in the 15 minutes Adrian had given him back at the warehouse. Federal financial crimes investigators moved differently from private security. Adrian had never seen them from this angle before. He'd always been on the other side of that particular relationship, and there was something almost abstract about watching them come around the restaurant building from the front and side. Entrances with the specific coordinated movement of people who had been briefed, who had paperwork, who had the particular authority that exists when the full architecture of the law is behind a single action. Cole's men came through the service exit 2 seconds after Adrian stopped. The alley was very well lit, suddenly, by the vehicle's lights. Adrian stepped to the side and let the geometry of the moment complete itself without him at the center of it, stood against the alley wall, and breathed a conscious breath, deliberate. The kind you take when you've been running on adrenaline and you need to begin the process of coming down before your hands start to shake. They didn't shake. Not yet. Marcus appeared beside him. Roland's people have been very forthcoming, he said quietly. The documentation was sufficient. Carver's material supplemented it. Cole. They'll go back inside for him. He's not going anywhere. The front is covered. Adrian nodded. He leaned against the alley wall and watched the systematic, organized process of Gareth Cole's operation, encountering the consequence of 4 years of patient documentation. He thought about Elena in her hospital room. He thought about the index card. He thought about Vivian, who was somewhere in this city, and who had not been in this building, and who was still moving. Vivian, he said. Marcus's expression shifted. She's not at the estate. She's not at her apartment. We've been tracking her phone since this afternoon. She went dark 2 hours ago. Adrian's jaw tightened. The hospital. Crofts got the 12th floor. Marcus. Vivian knows this building. She has spent time in this city. She knows people who know people. If she's gone dark and she's moving towards something. He straightened off the wall. She knows tonight is the end of the plan. Everything she built is collapsing. The only leverage left is the child, Marcus said. The word hit the alley air between them, and neither man waited for it to settle. Adrian was already walking. Marcus kept pace. Cars at the front. How long to the hospital? 25 minutes. Less if mine. They came around the building at a pace that was not quite running and was faster than walking, and Adrian saw Cole in the restaurant doorway, being handled with the specific physical language of people who had the authority to handle him, and Cole was looking out at the street, and he found Adrian's face in the movement and the light, and what passed across Cole's expression in that moment was not rage. It was something closer to recognition, the recognition of a man who has encountered, finally, the specific escalation that ends things. He had planned for Adrian's leverage and his compliance and his desperation. He had not planned for Adrian's willingness to dismantle his own structure in order to remove the value of the leverage. You couldn't use a man's empire against him if the man no longer had an empire to lose. Adrian didn't stop walking. The car was there. They got in. The driver already knew the destination. Adrian sat in the back seat and pulled out the real phone, the one that had been in the car, that Cole's man at the door had not found, and called Croft. It rang 4 times, 5. Croft answered on the 6th ring, and the first thing Adrian heard was the quality of the sound behind Croft's voice, a specific kind of background noise, movement, controlled urgency, and he knew before Croft spoke that something had happened. "Talk to me," Adrian said. "She got to someone on the hospital staff," Croft said. His voice had the controlled tension of a man managing a situation in real time. "A night nurse on 11, we don't know how long ago the contact was made. It was a setup before tonight. She used a hospital uniform and a staff ID that the system accepted. She was on the floor for a pause, some movement sounds. We got her at the elevator. She didn't make it to the room." Adrian breathed. "Elena is secure," Croft said. "She's secure. But Vivian, she's in the building. We have her on 12, but she's not." Another pause, and then Croft's voice changed tone in a way that Adrian had never heard from him before. Lower, more careful. "She's not going to the room, Mr. Voss. She's going up. The elevator is going." The call cut, not dropped. Cut. The signal terminated with the specific abruptness of a phone being disconnected physically, and Adrian stared at the screen and hit redial and got nothing. And he sat in the back of a car doing 20 miles over the posted speed through the nighttime city, and he understood what above the 12th floor meant in this specific hospital. The NICU was on the 14th floor, the floor he had stood on the previous night in a corridor, while Vivian Cross had stood beside him and put her mouth close to his ear. He called Patterson's direct line, the NICU nurse, the one who had let him stand over the incubator at 11 p.m. It rang twice, and Patterson answered, with the particular alertness of a woman who had been told tonight to stay alert. "There's a woman coming up," Adrian said. "She's in the building right now. She's heading for the 14th floor. She may have hospital credentials that scan correctly. I need you to lock the NICU, every access point. Do not open for anyone. I don't care what they show you. I don't care what they say. Can you do that? We have a security protocol. Engage it right now." "Right now, Patterson. Don't wait for me. Lock it down." Brief pause. "Then it's done. We're in lockdown. Don't open it until I'm there in person. My voice, my face. Nothing else." He ended the call. "How far?" he said. The driver said, 8 minutes. 8 minutes. Adrian sat in the back of the car with his hands flat on his thighs, and he looked out the window at the city, and he thought about his daughter in a locked room on the 14th floor, and he thought about Vivian Cross moving through a hospital in a stolen uniform. And he thought about what she intended to accomplish, because Vivian always intended to accomplish something specific. She wasn't panicking, she was adapting. The plan had collapsed, and she was moving to the only remaining piece she could still reach. Not to harm the child. He didn't think that. Even now, with everything he knew about her, he didn't think she would harm the child. Because Vivian was not Vivian without calculation, and harming the child destroyed every bit of remaining leverage. She would take the child if she could. Legal positioning, what Roland had described. Establish physical custody, even temporarily, create the legal complication, have the structural argument already in motion before Cole's operation was fully dismantled. She was operating from the final page of the plan, even as the rest of it burned. The car pulled up to the hospital entrance. Adrian was out the door before it stopped fully, moving across the entrance plaza in a way that made the two people coming out of the building step back without knowing why. The movement of a man with a very specific destination and nothing left to manage except the distance between here and there. The elevator was the wrong move. He went for the stairs. He took them 2 at a time. 12 floors. His lungs registered the objection. His legs registered the objection. He ran through both objections and kept moving, the stairwell flashing past in its institutional gray, his hand on the railing at each landing, for the half-second correction of direction, then off it again. He was aware of his own breathing in the specific way you become aware of it when it stops being background and starts being the loudest thing, ragged, hard, the body's honest accounting of 44 years and a sedentary 2 decades. He hit the 14th floor door. The corridor outside the NICU was not quiet. Vivian was there. She was standing at the NICU access door in the pale blue of a nursing uniform that didn't fit her quite right across the shoulders, and she had a badge in her hand that she'd been pressing to the reader, and the reader had been denying her because Patterson had locked it down. She knew she'd run out of time because she'd heard the stairwell door, and she'd turned, and now she and Adrian were 12 feet apart in the corridor of the 14th floor. She looked at him. He looked at her. He was breathing hard from the stairs. She could see it. She'd always been good at reading his physical state. It had been a tool for her, knowing when he was tired, knowing when he was off balance. She looked at his breathing and the sweat on his face, and she straightened up from the door scanner with the particular quality she had. The one he'd spent 3 years interpreting as composure and now understood as armor. "Adrian," she said. He didn't answer. He was breathing. Getting it under control. He pressed one hand to the wall and breathed for 3 seconds. "It's over," he said. "I know." Her voice was steady. The voice of a woman who had already processed the loss and moved to the next position. "Cole, federal custody," she absorbed this, a small movement in her jaw. Then Roland, "Yes." She looked at the door behind her, the locked NICU access, and then back at him. Her face did something complex in that moment. Not grief, not exactly. The expression of a woman who has been very many things to very many people, and is now, for possibly the first time, running out of versions to be. "Child is fine," she said. "I wasn't going to—" "I know what you were going to do," Adrian said. His breathing was steadier now. "I know the plan. I know all of it." She was quiet. "Step away from the door," he said. Something crossed her face. "And then what?" "And then you wait here until the people who are coming up behind me get here. And you make this the moment when you start choosing what you still have control over. Because right now, that's the only thing you have left." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. The corridor light was the particular blue-white of hospital night, and in it she looked the way people look when the performance has finally exhausted itself, not older, exactly, but more specific. More like whatever she actually was underneath 3 years of calibration. "You built all of this," she said, not accusatory, almost reflective. "The empire, the structure, the leverage. Every piece of it. Cole learned from your model, did you know that? He studied how you operated before he targeted you. He said you were the blueprint." Adrian said nothing. "You taught everyone around you how to use power as a weapon," she said. "I only learned from the lesson." He looked at her. "Step away from the door, Vivian." She took one step back. Then the elevator opened at the end of the corridor, and Croft came out first, followed by 2 other men, moving fast, and then slowing when they saw the situation was static. And Croft looked at Adrian, and at Vivian, and at the locked NICU door, and did the rapid assessment that Croft was good at. Adrian straightened off the wall. His breathing was controlled now. His hands were steady. He looked at Vivian Cross, at the woman who had been inside his life for 3 years, who had learned his patterns and his weaknesses, and the specific shape of what could be used against him. And he felt none of the things he might have expected to feel. Not the anger that had been building since the corridor. Not the cold violence that was his oldest response to betrayal. Something else. Something he didn't fully have words for yet. He turned to Croft. "She stays on this floor until the investigators from downstairs come up. Don't let her leave." Then he turned back to the NICU door and put his hand on it and waited. Inside, through the small reinforced window, he could see the rows of incubators. He could see the movement of Patterson at the far end of the room. He pressed the call button beside the door and said his name. And Patterson looked up and crossed the room and opened the door. And Adrian walked through into the blue-lit warmth of the NICU and walked to the incubator where his daughter was. And he stood there, looking at the dark hair and the small hands and the steady green lines on the monitor beside her. Behind him, through the closed door, he could hear the sounds of the corridor voices, movement, the systematic sounds of things being resolved. He watched his daughter breathe. Her chest rose and fell with a regularity that was, given everything that had preceded this moment, the most stabilizing thing he had encountered in the past 24 hours. Not dramatic, not a revelation. Just a small person doing the fundamental work of being alive, with the complete and unconscious commitment of someone who has not yet learned to do it any other way. He put his hand flat against the incubator glass. The warmth of it came through against his palm. He stayed there for a long time, not thinking about Cole, not thinking about the investigators downstairs, not thinking about the financial structures and the documents, and the dismantling of the apparatus he'd spent 11 years building. He thought about tomorrow, about Elena opening her eyes, about what he was going to say to her when she did, and what he wasn't going to say, and the very large and specific thing he was going to have to become in order to be in the same room with her honestly. He thought about what Vivian had said. "You taught everyone around you how to use power as a weapon." He pressed his hand harder against the glass. His daughter's chest rose. His daughter's chest fell. The monitors beeped their steady count. And in the corridor outside, the last pieces of the life he had built were being gathered up by people with the authority to decide what happened to them next. And Adrian Voss stood with his hand against warm glass and understood. with a completeness he had never managed before, that he had a choice to make that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with what came after it. He hadn't made it yet, but he was very close. Elena opened her eyes on a Tuesday morning, 11 days after the surgery. Adrian was there. He'd been there every morning, not all day, because there were things that required his presence elsewhere. Meetings with Bassett and the investigators and the financial forensics people who were working through the Meridian documents with the thoroughness of people who understood that the architecture of 4 years of careful fraud required equivalent patience to properly dismantle. But every morning he came before anything else, and he sat in the chair beside her bed, and he waited. He'd been reading a book he'd found in the hospital gift shop, a paperback thriller that he'd chosen without particular consideration. And that turned out to be poorly written, the characters thin and the plotting mechanical, and he'd read 200 pages of it anyway, because it gave his hands something to do. He set it face down on his knee when he heard the change in her breathing. She didn't surface cleanly. It came in stages of shifting, a small sound, her hand moving against the sheet in the specific way that hands move when consciousness is returning and the body is doing a preliminary inventory. He watched her face do the slow, difficult work of coming back. Her eyelids moved. Once, twice, then opened a fraction and closed again. Too much light, the automatic retreat of someone not ready yet. He didn't move. He didn't touch her. He waited, the way he'd been learning to wait. The third time her eyes opened, they stayed open. She looked at the ceiling first, the institutional white of it, the light fixture, the unremarkable geography of a hospital room. Then slowly she turned her head and found him. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was a long moment in which neither of them spoke. And in that moment, Adrian was aware of approximately 15 things. At once the sound of her breathing, the green lines on the monitor, the chair underneath him, the book on his knee, state of his own face, which he could not see, but which he understood, had changed considerably in the past 11 days, in ways that a mirror had confirmed without adequately explaining. He was aware of everything he needed to say, and had no idea how to begin any of it. Elena spoke first, the baby, she said. Her voice was rough from the tube that had been removed 4 days ago, a dry, scraped quality that was nothing like her usual voice, and it was the most straightforwardly human sound he had heard in 11 days. She's okay, he said. She's been gaining weight. They moved her to a lower dependency incubator 6 days ago. The doctors say she's ahead of where they'd expect for her gestational age. He paused. She's strong. Elena closed her eyes, not going away something else. The specific relief of a person absorbing good news they'd been afraid to need. You've been here, she said, still with her eyes closed. Every day, every morning. She opened her eyes and looked at the ceiling. You look terrible, she said. Something in his chest that had been locked for 11 days moved slightly. Did you sleep? Some. She turned her head and looked at him again. Fully this time, with the direct quality that had always been her most characteristic mode of attention. Elena had never been a person who looked at things sideways. She looked at things straight and waited for them to become clear, and that quality, which had sometimes felt like pressure and sometimes like judgment, now felt like the only honest thing in the room. Tell me what happened, she said. He told her, all of it. He started from the library, the drawer fractionally open, the note he hadn't fully read until Marcus relayed it, the anonymous call that had sent him to the East Gate. He told her about the hospital and Vivian in the corridor, and the doctor and the NICU. He told her about Marcus and the documents and Carver, whom she recognized with a small nod that told him the recognition was not surprise. He told her about Roland and the warehouse and Cole and the restaurant and the alley and the 14th floor. He left nothing out. He told it the way he should have told things to her years ago directly, without management, without calculating what version of the truth served him best. He'd spent 9 years in this marriage telling Elena versions of things. He sat in the chair beside her bed and told her the actual things, and watched her face as he did, and didn't look away from what passed across it. She didn't interrupt. She listened, the way she always listened completely, cataloging, assembling. He could see her building the picture in real time, fitting what he was telling her against what she already knew, which was considerable. He understood more fully now, known more about what was happening in their lives than he had. She had been more awake to it. When he finished, there was a silence. Carver, she said finally, he came to you at the hospital. The second day. He's a good man. A pause. He was very careful with me. He knew I was. She stopped. Started differently. He knew the situation was complicated. He never pushed me toward anything. Adrian nodded. The child, Elena said. You said primary objective. Her jaw tightened, the first visible anger, And it wasn't directed at Adrian, or not only. It was the anger of a woman who had understood something intellectually and is now experiencing what it means in her body. How long had that been the design? From before Vivian arrived. Cole targeted me specifically. She was the mechanism. Elena was quiet for a moment. Then I found the financial anomaly 14 months ago. I didn't know what it meant then. I thought it was internal, someone from your organization skimming. I started documenting because I didn't know who to trust, and I didn't. She stopped again. When she continued, her voice had the quality of someone being precise about something painful. I didn't know if I could bring it to you. Given everything. The architecture of 9 years of a marriage that had hollowed out by degrees. The affair that he'd conducted as though it were a category of business rather than a category of betrayal. Given everything covered considerable ground. I know, he said. I wasn't building a case against you, she said. I want you to know that. Carver probably told you that, but I want you to hear it from me. I was trying to protect. She touched her own stomach, briefly, a gesture that seemed automatic. Then she seemed to remember that her stomach was different now, post-surgery, and her hand stilled and moved to the sheet. I was trying to protect her. I know, he said again. And then, because the 2 words weren't enough, you did. What you built, the documents, the evidence, it's what allowed everything else to move. None of the rest of it happens without what you put together. She looked at him with an expression that was complicated and layered, and that he didn't try to read as any single thing. You turned it over, she said. The documents. Marcus told me one of the nurses told me he'd come to brief me yesterday. I wasn't fully. She pressed her lips together. You gave it to investigators. Yes, your financial structure. The Meridian holdings. They're being unwound. There are assets that were always legitimately held, the above-board investments. The real estate portfolio, those are intact. The criminal infrastructure, he held her gaze, gone, being dismantled systematically. Some of it by investigators, some of it I've done myself. Elena was very still. Some of the people who worked for me are going to face consequences they'd have avoided if I'd protected them the way I used to, he said. I didn't protect them. I cooperated fully instead. Some of them are angry about that. Most of them understand. A few of them are people I should have let go a long time ago, and I'm not going to lose sleep over their anger. And you, Elena said, what happens to you? This was the question he'd spent 11 days negotiating with Bassett and the investigators and his own conscience, in that order. I've given full cooperation. There are significant legal consequences, some financial penalties that will substantially reduce what remains, civil exposure on several matters. There will be a process. Bassett says it's manageable. I'll tell you that I don't fully care about manageable in the way I would have cared a month ago. Care about what we're left with after it's done. Elena looked at him for a long moment. We, she said. The word sat between them. If that's still a conversation, he said. I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. I'm not asking you for anything. I just want he stopped. Started differently. I wanted to tell you the truth. All of it. And I wanted to tell you that I understand. If after all of it you need the version of the future that doesn't include me in it, that's a decision I'll respect. Lena looked at the ceiling. She breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth, and he watched the even rise and fall of her chest, the chest that had been still in the ambulance and was now breathing with the full, ordinary effort of a body doing its work, and he waited. I want to see her, Elena said finally. I'll arrange it. As soon as the doctors say you can be moved. Today. He looked at her. Elena. Today, Adrian. I've been in this room for 11 days, and she's been 2 floors above me, and I need to... Her voice cracked once, and she let it and then held the next breath and steadied. I need to see my daughter. He stood up. It took an hour and a half of negotiation with Hallberg, and the physical therapist, and the nursing staff, and the arrangement that resulted involved a wheelchair and an IV pole on a rolling stand, and 2 nurses and the specific care people moving a post-surgical patient who was more determined than her body was ready for. Adrian walked beside her. He didn't hold her hand. She hadn't asked him to, and he understood without being told that the space between them was still being measured, and that touch required an invitation he hadn't yet been given. They took the elevator to 14. Patterson was waiting. She was the kind of person who became a NICU nurse for reasons that the profession itself made visible a competence, married to a specific gentleness, a combination of someone who understood that the parents in this room were always also patients in some sense. She looked at Elena in the wheelchair with the assessing eye of a nurse and the warmth of a woman who had been watching over someone's child and was glad to be able to return them. She's been waiting for you, Patterson said, which was not literally true, and which Elena understood was not literally true, and which was also, somehow, exactly right. They brought the wheelchair to the incubator. Adrian stood behind and to the left, far enough to give the moment its proper shape. He watched Elena lean forward from the chair and look through the incubator glass at her daughter. And he watched the expression on Elena's face do something that he did not have adequate language for, and would not have tried to describe even if he had. It was private in the way that some things are private even when witnessed. He looked away. He looked at his own hands for a while. Then Patterson, who understood her room and the people in it, moved quietly to the incubator and began to explain the protocol for handling the infant, the specific positioning, the importance of warmth and contact, the way to support the head, and Elena listened to every word, with the concentrated attention of someone memorizing something essential. And then Patterson opened the incubator port and guided Elena's hands inside. Adrian heard the sound Elena made, not a cry, not quite. Something that had been held a very long time, and was releasing through a very small opening, and he looked up and watched his wife hold her daughter. For the first time, both of them connected through the port of an incubator, Elena's hands cradling a person smaller than her forearm, and he understood that he was witnessing something that his absence would not have diminished, and that his presence should not inflate. He was a witness. That was what the moment required of him, and he was trying imperfectly to provide only what was required. He thought about the night he'd stood at this same incubator alone, his hand against the glass. He thought about what he'd promised himself then. 3 days later, Elena asked him to bring a chair to the NICU and stay. He brought the chair. He stayed. They didn't talk much that afternoon. Elena was in the rocker the nurses had positioned beside the incubator, and she held the baby in the careful way she'd been taught, and Adrian sat 4 feet away in a standard hospital chair that was built for function rather than comfort. And he read the bad thriller, and occasionally looked up, and occasionally Elena looked over, and neither of them performed anything for the other. At some point in the afternoon, Elena said, "I've been thinking about a name." "Okay," he said. "I want to hear if you object." "Okay." "Mara," she said. He said the name quietly to himself, the way you say a name when you're checking it against something interior. He didn't know what he was checking it against. He'd never had a framework for naming a person before. "I don't object," he said. Elena nodded. She looked down at the baby in her arms. "Mara Voss," Adrian said. Elena looked up. "Or whatever name she ends up with," he said carefully. "Depending on decisions, I don't need to know right now." Something moved through Elena's expression. "You're doing it again," she said, leaving space for me to leave, every other sentence. "I understand why, but it's also," she searched for the word, "exhausting. To have you be that careful." He set the book down. "I don't know how else to do it." "I know you don't." She looked back at the baby. A silence that was not hostile. "I haven't decided anything, Adrian. I haven't decided anything because I'm 2 weeks post-surgery, sitting in a hospital rocker, holding a premature infant, and I don't have the capacity to decide large things right now. Can you just—" She stopped. "Can you just be here? Without the constant disclaimer." "Yes," he said. "Just be here." "Yes." He picked the book back up. He read 3 more pages. Outside the NICU windows, the afternoon light was doing the specific thing it does in autumn, coming in at a lower angle, longer shadows, the quality of gold in it. Mara's monitors beeped their steady count. Elena rocked slowly. Adrian read a bad thriller and did not offer any further disclaimers, and it was the closest thing to ordinary that the 3 of them had yet managed. Vivian Cross entered a cooperation agreement with federal investigators 7 weeks after her arrest on the 14th floor. Adrian knew about it through Bassett, who tracked these things as a professional matter. The agreement required full disclosure of the Cole Network's operations contacts, financial flows, operational methods. She provided it. The disclosure was, by Bassett's account, comprehensive. She understood the value of comprehensive. Cole himself was in federal custody awaiting trial on charges that the investigators had described to Adrian, in one of their debrief sessions, as significant. The financial architecture that Roland Cross had built was being fully mapped. 2 of Cole's previous 3 targets had come forward once the network's exposure became public. One of them had lost everything. One had merely lost years. The third, the one who had disappeared, remained unaccounted for, which meant several things, none of them resolvable. Adrian sat through the investigator debriefs with Bassett beside him, and he answered every question fully, and he did not calculate what version of the truth served him, and it was the hardest professional thing he'd done in 11 years, not because the truth was shameful in every particular, some of it was, some of it wasn't, but because the habit of management was so deeply grooved that operating without it felt like walking with a missing piece of his proprioception, constantly slightly off balance. He got better at it. Not all at once, not gracefully. Roland Cross took his own cooperation agreement and gave the financial documentation in sufficient detail that his criminal exposure, while real and with genuine consequences, was navigated into something his attorney could work with. Adrian did not feel uncomplicated things about Roland. He didn't think he was supposed to. Roland had built a structure that had targeted Adrian's daughter and had sat in a warehouse and given the investigators everything they asked for, and both of those things were true simultaneously, and Adrian no longer had the luxury of resolving that kind of complexity into something simpler, because the simple version was almost always wrong. Marcus stayed. This was something Adrian had not assumed and had not asked for. Marcus had submitted everything, every document, every piece of the years of work they'd done together to the investigators, with the same comprehensiveness Adrian had. Some of what Sarkis submitted concerned things that Marcus had done on Adrian's behalf that implicated Marcus directly. And Marcus had submitted those things anyway, with the specific integrity of a man who had decided, at some point that he did not explain, and Adrian did not ask him to, that the accounting was going to be complete, or it was going to be nothing. Marcus kept his own legal process managed. He stayed on. He helped Adrian navigate the dismantling. On the last day of a particularly long debrief session, Adrian and Marcus sat in Bassett's conference room, after the investigators had gone and drank the office coffee, which was bad. And Marcus looked at the table and said, "My wife asked me why I was still doing this. What did you tell her? That I'd been doing it so long I needed to see what it looked like finished." Adrian looked at him, and Marcus considered. She said that was probably a lie, but a forgivable one. Adrian drank the bad coffee. She's probably right. They sat with that for a while. "What does finished look like to you?" Adrian said. "No idea," Marcus said. "I'll know it when I'm looking at it, I think." Adrian thought about that for the rest of the drive home. Mara came home on a Saturday in October. The home she came to was not the estate. The estate had been listed for sale 6 weeks after the night on the 14th floor, a decision that had required no particular deliberation on Adrian's part, because the deliberation had happened on its own, quietly, without ceremony, sometime in the weeks he'd been spending in hospital chairs. He simply understood one day that the estate was a monument to a version of himself he was not interested in maintaining the costs of, and he told Bassett to begin the process. The house they moved into was 20 minutes from the hospital, a practical choice, still close to Mara's follow-up appointments, with 4 bedrooms, and a yard that had 2 oak trees and grass that needed cutting, and no stone wall, no gate, no armed men at the perimeter. A house that looked like a house. Elena had chosen it. He'd seen 4 options that Bassett had put together, and he'd said, "This one is Elena's decision." And she'd looked at them from her hospital bed, on the day she was well enough to manage the concentration required, and she'd pointed at the one with the oak trees. He didn't ask why that one. He thought he knew. They came home from the hospital in an ordinary car. His car now was ordinary. A gray sedan with adequate safety ratings and no particular provenance. Croft had found him something else to do, which was a conversation that had been delicate, and that Croft had handled with the directness that was his best quality, understanding that the transition was permanent without being told twice. The gray sedan had no one following it. There was no advanced security at the house. It was Adrian and Elena and a car seat and a diaper bag, and the specific logistical complexity of moving an infant who had spent the first weeks of her life in controlled medical conditions into an environment that was merely domestic. Mara made her opinion of the car seat known throughout the entire drive. Elena sat in the back with her and talked to her in the low, continuous voice that Elena had apparently developed in the rocker. In the NICU, Adrian had listened to it from his chair through many afternoons, a voice that didn't demand anything from the baby and didn't perform calm but simply occupied the same space steadily so the baby knew someone was there. He drove and listened to it and watched the city move past and thought about nothing specific. They carried her through the front door of the house on the Oak Tree Street, and the house was received them without ceremony. In the weeks that followed, there were hard days and harder nights. Mara was home, but Mara was not the kind of baby who rationed her communication. She had opinions about hunger and light and temperature and the precise distance between herself and her mother's body, and she communicated these opinions with the full commitment of someone who had spent 7 weeks in a NICU learning that clear signal production was a survival skill. Elena was recovering from surgery and exhausted and honest about both of those things. In a way, she'd never been with him about her physical states before, which he understood was a form of trust extended in increments, and he tried to receive it carefully. He got up for the 2 a.m. feeding more nights than not. Elena would wake at the first sound. The maternal antenna was wired too tight for her to sleep through it, but he was faster getting out of bed than she was, still tender in her incision, and if he was already up and moving, she would settle back and rest. And he would sit in the nursery with the oak trees visible through the window, in whatever light the night provided, holding Mara with the specific clumsiness of a man learning something he should have been building toward for years, and he would watch her eat and watch her eyes, which were still the unfocused blue of early infancy, moving without settling, exploring a world that was endlessly incomprehensible and apparently fascinating. He talked to her sometimes, not about anything in particular. He told her about the oak trees. He told her about the city. He told her about her mother with the directness and accuracy of a man who understood he was speaking to someone who deserved the truth about their origins, even before she could comprehend it, because the habit of truth had to start somewhere, and the beginning was always the right place to start. He was still dismantling things. The legal process had its own pace and its own demands, and there were days when Bassett called with information that required several hours of difficult work, and there were days when the investigator team needed him to clarify something that required revisiting years of choices he'd made in worse versions of himself. He did the work. He came home. He ate dinner at the table with Elena, quiet dinners, frequently interrupted, never long enough for the food to be fully warm. And he understood that each dinner was its own small negotiation between where they were and where they might eventually get to, and that the negotiation was going to take considerably longer than the dismantling. One evening in November, Elena sat across from him at the table after Mara was down, which was early by the standards of that particular week, and she had a glass of water, and he had the remains of a meal that had been good before the interruptions, and she looked at him with the direct look she'd had since the hospital. Bassett says the process should be substantially concluded by spring, she said. He's optimistic. But probably yes, and then what? Turned his fork over in his hand, set it down. I've been looking at legitimate investment opportunities. There are a few that Bassett thinks are viable, given what remains of the financial holdings. Nothing like before, a different scale, but real. Legal, completely. She nodded slowly. I know it's not a plan, he said. I know spring is months away, and the months between now and then have a lot of... He searched for the right word and came up with an honest one. Unknown in them. Yes, Elena said. I know I don't get to skip ahead to the version where things are settled. I know there's work before that. A lot of work, she said. Not with cruelty, with accuracy. Yes. He looked at her. I'm not going anywhere, Elena. I want to be clear about that, not as a disclaimer, not as an escape hatch you can decide to use or not use. I'm not going anywhere. I'll do whatever the work requires. I understand that what I did, all of it, not just the last 2 months, but years created damage that isn't fixed because I've started trying. I understand it. She looked at him across the table. I believe you, she said, simply. He wasn't sure he deserved the simplicity of it. He didn't say that. He accepted it the way he was trying to learn to accept things without qualifying it into something smaller. They cleared the table together. He washed. She dried, a division of labor that had arrived without being negotiated, the way some arrangements arrive. Mara made a brief sound from the nursery that resolved itself without intervention, and both of them went still for the duration of it, and then continued when it ended, and that was also a kind of ordinary that he hadn't known how to value before. Spring arrived with the particular abruptness of that city's spring weeks of cold, and then 1 week of everything blooming simultaneously, as if the season had been impatient. The legal process concluded in March. Not perfectly, there were civil settlements that cost money he had less of now, and there were ongoing monitoring conditions that Bassett managed with professional quietude, and there were names in certain circles that he would carry the way some things are carried, not as decorations but as weight that goes where you go. Primary process concluded. Cole's trial had been running for 2 months by then. The evidence was comprehensive, and the outcome, Bassett said, was not seriously in doubt. Vivian's cooperation testimony was part of the prosecution's structure, and she was being processed through her own separate agreement, the details of which Adrian had stopped tracking at some point, because he understood that her story was not his story to follow to its end. He thought about her, sometimes. Less than he would have expected, and differently than he would have expected, not with anger, which had passed through him fully and completely in the months after the hospital, and had been given its appropriate time, and had then gradually ceased to be the most useful thing available. He thought about what she'd said on the 14th floor. You built all of this. I only learned from the lesson. He thought about whether this was true and in what proportion, and what the honest answer to that required of him. The honest answer required quite a lot. He tried to give it. One Saturday in April, he took Mara to the park with the oak trees 2 blocks from the house. Asina was at a follow-up appointment. She had them still, less frequently now. The recovery measured in milestones that the doctors marked with the satisfaction of people watching something work the way it was supposed to. He had the diaper bag and the stroller and the specific competence he'd been building in the mechanics of infant logistics for 5 months, and he navigated the 2 blocks with the efficiency of practice. The park was ordinary. There were other parents, other children. There were pigeons conducting their own business across the path. There was a bench in the sun, and Adrian sat on it with the stroller parked beside him, and Mara in it with her eyes open, which was her primary mode of engagement with the world, now watching, tracking the blue of her early infancy, transmuting into something darker and more specific. She looked at the oak trees. He watched her look at the oak trees. He thought about what she would know about him. Not now she knew him as proximity and voice, and the smell of his jacket, and the sound of his breathing at 2 a.m. But eventually. The things that eventually arrived, when children developed the capacity to understand the categories of who the people in their lives had been. He would tell her the truth, he decided that. Not all at once. Not before she could hold it, but in the increments that were appropriate, he would tell her the truth. About what he'd built, about what it cost, about the people who had been hurt by the machinery of his life, before he understood what the machinery was doing. About her mother's courage, and her mother's patience, and her mother's specific, quiet determination to protect her before she was born. About a man who learned something essential very late, and tried to do something with it anyway. Elena arrived at the park at noon, walking the 2 blocks from the car. She was moving well now. The careful quality of her movement from the hospital months was gone, and in its place was something more like herself. The particular directness of how Elena inhabited space that he'd known for 9 years, and that he'd understood the value of too late, and was grateful, in the plainest possible sense, to still be able to observe. She sat down on the bench beside him. They both looked at Mara, who was looking at the trees. "How was the appointment?" he said. "Good. He cleared me for everything." A pause. He also said, "I'm doing better than he expected, given everything." "You're always doing better than expected," he said. She looked at him sideways. The edge of her mouth moved. "Is that funny?" he said. "A little," she said, "coming from you." He nodded. "Probably." They sat in the sun for a while. Mara tracked a pigeon with the concentration of someone for whom pigeons were still among the more remarkable things available. Park went about its business around them. Children, dogs, someone with a bicycle navigating the path at the ambitious speed of someone who had miscalculated the pedestrian density. "She's going to need a bigger stroller," Elena said. "In another couple months, I know. I looked at some options." "Course you did." He looked at her. She was looking at Mara. There was something in her profile that he'd been cataloging without meaning to, since the hospital equality in her face that was different from before, or that he was seeing differently, which amounted to the same thing practically. The careful architecture of their coexistence, the 9 years of managed distance, had been replaced by something that didn't have an established name in his experience. Something that was still in the process of defining itself. He didn't try to rush the definition. "Adrian," she said. She didn't say anything for a moment. She watched Mara track the pigeon with that total infant focus. "Then you lost everything you built." "Yes, and you chose to." "Yes." She turned and looked at him with the direct look. "Why?" He held her gaze. He thought about the night on the 14th floor with his hand against the warm glass. He thought about what he'd understood in that moment about leverage, about what it means to have something that matters enough to be used against you, and about the specific quality of understanding that arrives when a person stops running from the thing they're most afraid to look at. "Because the things I was protecting weren't the things worth protecting," he said. "I knew that for a long time. I just couldn't figure out what to do with the knowing." Elena looked at him. "She made it clearer," he said, and nodded at Mara. Standing in that room. Suddenly it was very clear. A silence. "Not empty. It doesn't fix anything," Elena said. "Just so we're clear. I know. It's a start. That's all it is." "Start. I know," he said again. "I'll take it." Elena looked back at Mara, who had lost interest in the pigeon, and was now examining her own hand with the earnest fascination of someone encountering it for the first time, which was more or less accurate. Sunlight moved across the bench. Somewhere in the park a child was laughing at something its parent had done. The oak trees moved in the mild April wind. Adrian Voss sat on a bench in an ordinary park, with nothing to protect and nothing to leverage, and nothing to manage, and no walls around him. And he felt the specific weight of that not as loss, not as the aftermath of loss, but as the thing itself. The actual feeling of a man who has put down something very heavy and is still getting used to what his hands do without it. He'd been wrong about many things for a very long time. He was trying to be right about this. Mara closed her fist around nothing and opened it again and looked at it like she was waiting for the answer to appear in her palm. And he watched her, and beside him Elena sat in the spring sun and breathed, and the morning continued in all its ordinary and unremarkable grace, and none of it was easy, and all of it was real. And that finally, honestly, was enough. He was breathing hard from the stairs. She could see it. She'd always been good at reading his physical state. It had been a tool for her, knowing when he was tired, knowing when he was off balance. She looked at his breathing and the sweat on his face, and she straightened up from the door scanner with the particular quality she had. The one he'd spent 3 years interpreting as composure and now understood as armor. "Adrian," she said. He didn't answer. He was breathing, getting it under control. He pressed one hand to the wall and breathed for 3 seconds. "It's over," he said. "I know." Her voice was steady. The voice of a woman who had already processed the loss and moved to the next position. "Cole, federal custody," she absorbed this, a small movement in her jaw. Then Roland, "Yes." She looked at the door behind her, the locked NICU access, and then back at him. Her face did something complex in that moment. Not grief, not exactly. The expression of a woman who has been very many things to very many people, and is now, for possibly the first time, running out of versions to be. "Child is fine," she said. "I wasn't going to—" "I know what you were going to do," Adrian said. His breathing was steadier now. "I know the plan. I know all of it." She was quiet. "Step away from the door," he said. Something crossed her face. "And then what?" "And then you wait here until the people who are coming up behind me get here. And you make this the moment when you start choosing what you still have control over. Because right now, that's the only thing you have left." Vivian looked at him for a long moment. The corridor light was the particular blue-white of hospital night, and in it she looked the way people look when the performance has finally exhausted itself, not older, exactly, but more specific. More like whatever she actually was underneath 3 years of calibration. "You built all of this," she said, not accusatory, almost reflective. "The empire, the structure, the leverage. Every piece of it. Cole learned from your model, did you know that? He studied how you operated before he targeted you. He said you were the blueprint." Adrian said nothing. "You taught everyone around you how to use power as a weapon," she said. "I only learned from the lesson." He looked at her. "Step away from the door, Vivian." She took one step back. Then the elevator opened at the end of the corridor, and Croft came out first, followed by 2 other men, moving fast, and then slowing when they saw the situation was static. And Croft looked at Adrian, and at Vivian, and at the locked NICU door, and did the rapid assessment that Croft was good at. Adrian straightened off the wall. His breathing was controlled now. His hands were steady. He looked at Vivian Cross, at the woman who had been inside his life for 3 years, who had learned his patterns and his weaknesses, and the specific shape of what could be used against him. And he felt none of the things he might have expected to feel. Not the anger that had been building since the corridor. Not the cold violence that was his oldest response to betrayal. Something else. Something he didn't fully have words for yet. He turned to Croft. "She stays on this floor until the investigators from downstairs come up. Don't let her leave." Then he turned back to the NICU door and put his hand on it and waited. Inside, through the small reinforced window, he could see the rows of incubators. He could see the movement of Patterson at the far end of the room. He pressed the call button beside the door and said his name. And Patterson looked up and crossed the room and opened the door. And Adrian walked through into the blue-lit warmth of the NICU and walked to the incubator where his daughter was. And he stood there, looking at the dark hair and the small hands and the steady green lines on the monitor beside her. Behind him, through the closed door, he could hear the sounds of the corridor voices, movement, the systematic sounds of things being resolved. He watched his daughter breathe. Her chest rose and fell with a regularity that was, given everything that had preceded this moment, the most stabilizing thing he had encountered in the past 24 hours. Not dramatic, not a revelation. Just a small person doing the fundamental work of being alive, with the complete and unconscious commitment of someone who has not yet learned to do it any other way. He put his hand flat against the incubator glass. The warmth of it came through against his palm. He stayed there for a long time, not thinking about Cole, not thinking about the investigators downstairs, not thinking about the financial structures and the documents, and the dismantling of the apparatus he'd spent 11 years building. He thought about tomorrow, about Elena opening her eyes, about what he was going to say to her when she did, and what he wasn't going to say, and the very large and specific thing he was going to have to become in order to be in the same room with her honestly. He thought about what Vivian had said. You taught everyone around you how to use power as a weapon. He pressed his hand harder against the glass. His daughter's chest rose. His daughter's chest fell. The monitors beeped their steady count. And in the corridor outside, the last pieces of the life he had built were being gathered up by people with the authority to decide what happened to them next. And Adrian Voss stood with his hand against warm glass and understood, with a completeness he had never managed before, that he had a choice to make that had nothing to do with power and everything to do with what came after it. He hadn't made it yet, but he was very close.